All right. Here's our subject for our second paint along video. This is Athak, the evil warrior from Reaper Miniatures. And plan today is to do like a red cloak, some gold metallics and some silver metallics. And we're going to use a dark green as our black. Our primary color is going to be red. And we're going to try to build up some nice bright highlights in the red. And we're also going to use true metallic gold. Try to make an interesting looking shield. This creepy shield he's got here. Apparently, if you're using it in a D&D game, the shield like changes expression. It's like an emoji shield. Yeah, so that's the plan. So we did this class last week, and there were some video recording problems. I've been trying to get this video redone. There was a fire in the building last week, and it's been too noisy to get the video redone. And they're back at it again today. The fire was on the upper floors. There's no damage in here, fortunately, but there's a lot of construction going on. So there's going to be some banging noises in the background. I apologize for that, but there's nothing I can do about it except wait for a few weeks to do the video, and that's just not going to work. So that was our first attempt at this mini. We did this in a class here in the studio a few weeks ago. Sorry, a few months ago, actually. And so we chose that for the subject for the class we did a couple of weeks ago. And there it is. There's the shield with the bright red highlights and the green gem and the creepy red on the gold. And what we're going to do today is basically the same thing again. We're going to use this guy. And we're going to use green as our black, as I said, build up some nice bright red highlights, and have some fun with the metallics on the gold. So the colors we're going to use today, we're going to use, as I said, you don't really have to match the colors. If you want to see the colors I'm using, there's a list at the start of the video. You just focus in on that, and there's the list again. They don't have to match the colors. I'm going to use this green liner as my dark green, but like a pine green, any kind of dark, cold green is going to work. Deep red and blood red for our reds. I was going to use tarnished brass. I used tarnished brass last time. I'm not going to use that today. I'm going to do something a bit different. But I'm going to use the dragon gold and the new gold. And then we'll use some silvers to do the other metallics. And at the end, I think we'll do a green gem. That's the plan. All right. So I'll get the palette loaded up. I'm going to start with quite a lot of this green liner, because that's effectively, like I said, it's going to be my black, so I'm going to use that quite a bit. For the red on the cloak, we're going to use the deep red, a fair bit of that, and that's going to be across the top. So everything for the cloth is going to be on the top. The green is going to be in the middle, and then the gold metallics I'll probably put across the bottom, and the silver I'll put somewhere over there when we get to that stage. All right. There's our blood red. I'm going to use golden blonde to create the highlights in the blood red. And this works pretty well because it's a very yellowy, warm off-white. And the yellow works as a good color to highlight red. And the white works to increase the value to make the highlights lighter. I'm also going to put a bit of straight white. This is a solid white from Reaper, in case I feel like making things a little bit lighter. For our gold, we're going to start with, well, we're going to use this dragon gold. And we're going to highlight that with new gold. Now, typically I don't put the metallics in the palette until later, but because they fall apart with the addition of water to them. And we'll see how that happens in the palette and how we're going to deal with that in a bit later on. Okay, so there's our main colors. I'll add the steel colors later on. We use a fairly large brush for that. Actually, it's not the biggest brush. This is a size 1 round brush. And yep, so I have a fairly large brush to work with. First thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start with the red. And I'm going to take a bit of that red, bring it down here by the green, and I make a 50-50 mix of the red and the green. This is to make a really dark brown, almost a black. Okay, and this is what I'm going to use to put the shadows in the metallics on the shield. Okay, so I'm going to go back in on the shield, and everywhere that I've got a really deep crevice, I'm going to start by making it extra dark by painting in those shadows with this combination of of green and red. So around the eyes, in the eye sockets, anywhere that I really want to have a strong shadow when I'm done. And this technique is, well, typically it's called underpainting. So what I'm doing is putting in a shadow, I'm darkening the shadows and creating a bit of a value sketch. So value is the relative light and dark of the paint. Areas that the light is shining on the miniature will be higher value, will be lighter. Areas that are in shadow will be darker, they have a lower value. So by starting with this very dark color, I'm making sure all the shadows are very dark. Especially you want to do that on the metallics, so we get nice strong contrast in the metallics. So I should mention that the first thing I do when I'm painting any mini is choose the light direction. And on this one, my light direction is going to be coming from above his right shoulder, so kind of directly above this part of the shield is my light source. So as I'm highlighting, I'm always going to be thinking about the lights coming from that direction. All right, let's keep going with these dark shadows on the gold. All the way around that tongue. I think I'll put some in that line around the eyes. Side of that nose, that'll do the job. Really dark. Okay, we're going to do that on the under bat wings as well. So underneath these little things on his helmet, make that a nice gold shadow. I'm going to do it inside these low parts in the wing as well. And I can lighten it up again later if I've made it too dark. But my experience has been that it's easier to make things. It's a bit difficult to shove the dark paint in to a small area that you want to make darker. There's different blending techniques you can do that, but we're trying to keep this at a beginner level, so we're not going to do that sort of advanced blending today. So what we're doing is making sure our shadows are really dark before we start painting to make it easier on ourselves later on. The Y in the front of that helmet. Paint all around the base of that helmet. A little more paint. This shield thing on his chest has some little insignias on it. I'm going to fill those in with this shadow as well. I'm going to make this shield shape, this round shield shape is going to be gold. This little thing down here is going to be gold. Shadow around that. We're going to make this armor at the front here gold, so make a nice dark shadow around that. There we go. That works. And I think this part of, oh, we've got to do the back of the bat wing still. Sorry. There we go. These two blades, we need that color under those blades as well. These weird shoulder pauldron things he's got going on. Let's outline this pad looking thing on the back of his armor. Do the same thing on the front. There. That's going to work. I think the last place we need to worry about is these little accoutrements. So this is going to be steel. We're going to make this ball on the top gold. Now, normally when I do these classes live, there's people that are asking questions. We're having a little chat as we paint along, and I go slowly to make sure people keep up. But today I'm just going to paint at my own normal speed. So it's going to be fairly quick, but I'm assuming that anytime there's a step you want to spend a bit more time on, you're just going to pause the video and take your time and then catch up and then restart the video. So I'm just going to paint at my own normal speed today. There we go. Get those little accoutrements on there. I think that in there is a piece of gold armor. I think I missed that on the previous models. I think today we're going to make that a bit of gold armor as well, right in there in those crevices under his armpits. Declare that to be a piece of metal. It's much clearer on this mini. The one we did last time was the bones mini, and that looks like a piece of cloth on the bones mini. This is the metal one, pewter one. The details are a bit crisper on it. So that's what we're going to do. There we go. So got a bit of a start point for our gold, and we're going to let that dry. And now we're going to go with just a straight green liner. I'm going to do a similar process on all the cloth. So I'm going to paint in really dark shadows all around the cloth. I'm going to start, this inside of the shield is quite difficult to access. So I'm going to paint the inside of the shield this dark green, and then just kind of forget that it exists and pretend that dark green is good enough. This is a single cast model, model's cast in a single piece. So you can't leave the shield off and paint that first and then attach it later. It's a one-piece deal, so you have to simplify a little bit things to make it work. So I'm going to paint all the folds in the cloth. Anywhere there's like a little recess in the cloth is going to get this dark color. You don't have to be super precise about this. Like if I get a bit of this on the metal, I'm not worried about it. But at this early stage, it doesn't matter, right? Because we're going to be putting a lot of layers of paint on this, and we can correct things later. The general idea, though, is that this paint is so dark that it's going to show through anything that we put over the top of it, making those shadows darker. And where we're going to paint the main part of the cloth red, when you mix green and red, you get a brown, right? And when you mix a very, very dark green and a very, very dark red, you get a brown so dark that it's visually it looks like black. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to be putting this dark green on, and we paint red over it. It's going to make the red that's over the top of this green look nearly black. And that's going to give us a really deep shadow, a really strong contrast from our lit areas. There we go. There's some loud construction happening as they're banging pieces of metal into place upstairs. Tried doing this yesterday, and as soon as I started the video, they started hammering. They'd been quiet most of the day, and then just as soon as I pressed play or press record, they started hammering. That's the way it goes. So yeah, so just quickly painting in all the shadows. I suppose I should try staying on screen. Yeah, painting in all the shadows. Anywhere that two surfaces meet, paint in a line of shadow. In all the recesses in the cloth. So like, for example, in this sleeve, the interior part of the sleeve and behind the staff here. If my light's coming from this direction, it's not going to hit there. That area inside there is all going to be in shadow, so I'm going to paint it this dark, dark green color. But I didn't want to just rub it off. right under there. Go. The shadow areas on the glove in between the fingers is going to be in a shadow, so we'll paint that dark green. Where the glove meets the staff is going to be a shadow. Under this thumb, between the fingers again. Between the glove and the shirt. Love it. Lots of noise today. Here's a good example of what I'm talking about. In this sleeve, there's some creases. So we want this dark green to be in the low part of all of those creases on the sleeve. Then when we come back and paint red later, we're going to focus on the raised areas with the red. That's going to give us a nice contrast. All right, keep working my way around. Back of this model, I did the zenithal highlight on it with the airbrush to start. You don't necessarily need to do that. If you started with a gray model, this process of darkening the shadows is going to look more extreme. If you start with a black model, it'll be basically invisible until you start painting the red. And if you started with a model that was painted white, you're probably going to have to put this green layer on a couple of times to get it to be really, really dark. So that's why I like starting with the black first coat of paint. And then we're going to build up the colors and build up the values till they're lighter. And when we're done, we'll have very, very dark shadows, nice bright highlights, lots of contrast. Okay, carrying all the way around. Back of the other sleeve. Right in all those crevices. And as I go through this, I'm going to do the same sequence all the time. I'm going to start on the front of the model, and then kind of work my way 360 all the way around the model, making sure I hit everything. And I do that with each color in sequence. And I think that underneath the tongue in there is going to be where I want a really dark shadow. So on top of the red that I did, I'm also going to put a green shadow on the back side of the tongue, inside that one nostril, and inside his lip. Make those really dark. Yeah, there we go. Happy with that. Okay, so now we need to give that time to dry. So we're going to switch back to working on the metal. And we're going to do that each time. We do a base coat or a layer. We're going to switch to work in another area, give it time to dry. So now I'm going to start working with the dragon gold. Now, last time I did this, I did the dragon gold and then did a wash with the deep red over it. I'm going to try something different this time. I'm going to start with the deep red and add a lot of dragon gold to it to make a red gold. And that's going to be my first layer of paint for the metallic areas. I've already got a bit of this red color on there. So this layer should go on top of that previous red layer pretty smoothly by having it's like a half step between the red and the gold by mixing the two together. That's going to give us a good foundation. All right, not too much paint on the brush. And bearing in mind that my light is at the top, so I'm going to pull all my brush strokes from the shadows up towards the light, so that wherever you lift the brush is where the most paint gets deposited. So I'm going to start in the areas that I want to be relatively dark and pull the brush towards the light. And you're going to hear me say that repeatedly. Now these metallics can be a little bit hard to paint over, so I want to be careful not to get too much of the metallic into any of the shadow areas. Just going to be a little bit careful about it. If you make a mistake at this stage, it's not irreversible. It just takes a couple of extra layers of paint to cover over any of the metallics that ended up where you didn't want them. This spot on his head, as I said, or on the shield right here, is going to be the brightest, the lightest spot on the whole mini. So essentially every brushstroke that I do points towards that spot on the mini. Some places you won't be able to do that, like in here I need to go the other way. But then when I put the layer on pulling downwards, but then I reverse, pull upward so that most of the paint ends up there, closer to my light source. Wow. Can I apologize for the noise, but it's either do no videos for a few weeks or endure a bit of noise. So that's the way it's going to be. Excuse me. Not too concerned about making this a perfect layer. We're going to be putting quite a few more layers of gold color over this, so it doesn't have to be perfect, okay? There we go. Looks a bit patchy. I like it. I'm going to do that on all the armor. So, oh, this is a spot on the side of his tongue. Let's hit that now. So this little patch in here. This little bit of scale mail kind of looking stuff. Now you notice I haven't been thinning my paint with anything as I go. I'm not using a medium, I'm not adding water, and that's pretty normal for the way I paint. Particularly with metallics, if you start getting water into them, they stop behaving very effectively as a paint, become more difficult to work with, so I'm going to avoid doing that. If I need to clean my brush out, make sure I get all the water out of the brush on the paper towel before I go to load up the brush with more paint. It's going to make things a bit easier for me. Okay, so we need to get that gold plate in there under his arm. Right back in there. I'm going to paint this whole piece of his chest, even though I'm going to make the border of it silver. For now, I'm going to paint it all gold. Come along slowly. Painting up that armor under his sleeve. Some of the armor is a bit difficult to reach in there. We'll get those other areas when we go around and do the back of it. I'm going to do his helmet. And for the bat wings, I'm going to turn Mini upside down so that I can pull the paint across the top towards my light source. I don't really want to paint all of the wings. I just want to paint like a bit of the more raised areas so that they look extra shiny. The contrast between the matte red and the metallic gold is going to give us an interesting look when we're done. Okay, now we need to do the little bits of area of trim on this crazy looking mace. Oh, missed a bit of the bat wing there. Let's do that. Okay. To the other side. Okay, so now we're back into, we're going to do the back of the helmet and the back of the plates on his body. So in under that armpit there. Now just remember with this layer, we don't want to cover over completely that dark red and dark green that we painted in. Let's just leave a little bit of that showing anywhere that two surfaces meet. So like on this little metal pad on his back, paint most of it, but I'm not painting all the way up to the adjacent plates. I'm leaving a little bit of that dark red showing. It's going to help make our contrast stronger. Same thing in between these plates. I'm not too worried about getting the dark red in between there completely covered. Awkward to get a brush down inside there. Okay, back of the helmet. And back of the wings now. And these are the wing shapes. Just gonna kind of hit the outwards concave shapes and the little bits of like the wing bones kind of thing. We don't have to cover all of it. Just where the light would catch on the outside of those round shapes is where I'm kind of what I'm aiming for. Okay, there we go. There's our first coat of metallic on this guy. Now, I'm going to do the first layer of red. Switch back. So I did the metallics with a synthetic brush. And I'm painting everything non-metallic with a sable brush. Make sure my brush is nice and clean. That green liner and the deep red are both colors that are kind of hard to clean out of the brush, so we'll give it a bit of extra time. All right, so there's my clean brush. Got my red ready to go. I'm going to take some out of, this is like my little reservoir paint. I'm going to pull some of the red off to the side. Kind of work it into the brush. Roll in the brush as I go, so the paint is in the brush, not just lopped and blobbed on the outside of the brush, so when I go to put the brush on, there's not too much paint, and I'm not going to get a big mess. All right, so I'm going to start inside on his right sleeve, and I'm aiming for any raised areas. I'm not going to completely cover any of those really dark green shadow areas that I previously painted. I want to keep those quite dark and in shadow. So particularly in this area under the shield, you don't really need to paint that much of it. Just the most raised areas, like the upper part of his sleeve, the shapes of his fingers, things like that. Don't cover everything over with the red. You want it to be quite dark in there. But you can see in the video, it's so dark, almost impossible to make out those shapes, which is what I want. I want them to disappear into the dark in there. Again, this is the deep red that I'm using right now. All right. So that's that sleeve, and I'm going to start working my way around this robe. And same principle. I'm just going to focus on the upper part and the raised areas of these shapes. So like a fold like this, I'm going to paint the upper surface of it, but I'm not going to paint the bottom. Leave the bottom this dark green. I'll do that on all these shapes. Be careful not to cover over all of the dark green. Just so we want those shadows to stay, and it's going to be visible pretty much right to the end of the paint job. Okay, there we go. Outside part of this robe on the front. We're going to do that same thing down here on this lower part of the skirt. The light is more that way, so I'm going to focus on that side of these shapes with the red. And leave the opposite side almost totally green. Go. Now I'm going to work down a part of the robe. Okay, now I'm going to rotate the menu to make it a bit easier for myself to get my brush strokes going in the right direction. So I'm going to be pulling from the bottom upwards on all of those shapes. Wherever I can. Some places it's not possible and I have to have the brush go the other way. Just be cognizant, you don't want to cover the green. If you make a mistake and you get some of this red over the gold, don't worry about it. This red color is already mixed into that gold, so it won't show up too badly, and it'll be easier to cover over when we do the next layers of gold. So nothing to be too concerned about. Just try to be neat, but it doesn't have to be perfect all the way from the stage. All right, now the sleeve, same idea. Focusing on the raised areas. all the way up to the top. Try not to hit the gold too much. Go. Now we do that glove. This crazy looking mace is going to be a steel handle. Maybe a bit of leathery looking stuff on that little bit down there. Cover that over with a bit of a mix of black and silver later on. Okay, so now I'm into the back of this shirt. And turn it over to make it easier for myself again with the brush strokes. I want the brush strokes going upwards. And the back of the mini is going to be darker than the front because the light source, our main light source, is from the front of the mini. So I'm not going to paint the back as light as I did the front. So not such a big deal right now. This color is pretty much going everywhere. When we start to do the lighter colors and the lighter highlights, we're going to focus those more towards the front and definitely keep them pointed towards the light source all the way through. I'm going to do all these little raised areas. You can probably spot a few places that I missed with my green liner or with my first black coat of paint. That'll happen. When you spot those things, just take a moment and fill them in. Not a big deal. There we go. Now the light coming across his shoulder, it's not going to hit the upper part of this cloak too much. It's definitely going to be a bit more of a shadow in there and brighter towards the bottom. So what I'm going to do is start in the middle, make my brush strokes go downwards because it's going to be a bit brighter where it flares out at the bottom, just a bit brighter. Lighter, I mean. Turn it over. I do my brush strokes pulling towards the top on the upper part of that cloak. So when I'm done, I should end up with a bit of a highlight, a bit of a highlight there, and a highlight at the bottom where it kind of comes out past the light source, or into the light. It comes out of the shadow into the light. To the sleeve, and then we're going to do the rest of that cloak under there. So a lot of people ask me at this point, why am I not just painting everything red if red is my base coat? Well, I like the idea of the darker colors showing through, and I like really strong contrast. So I like having that those really dark colors be quite visible out from underneath those layers. So I like doing dark layers and then not completely covering them over. It gives a really strong contrast. It also makes the highlights that I want to be brighter, to be more prominent, makes the contrast really pushes them out. You've got those dark colors quite visible in the shadows. Yeah, it just makes stronger contrast. And I personally don't mind a messy paint job. To me, it's more important to have the right colors, which are the right value, so the right light or dark paint in the right places. It's more important than having a perfect base coat and a perfect blend. And especially as a beginner, if you can focus on having your mini look dramatic and look brightly lit, your minis are going to pop more than if you have a perfect base coat. That pop comes from having good, strong contrast. Not just any contrast, set up so that the highlights, that the bright spots are in the right places. It's going to give you a good pop on your mini. And then the blending and the perfect base coats and all that can come in time. So you want something to focus on, that's what I focus on. Okay, so there's our first coat of red. We're going to let that dry. Now we're back into gold. So we've done our first coat of gold paint. That's quite dry now. So now I'm going to load up my brush with just straight dragon gold. Now it might have separated out on your palette, so you might have to mix it a little bit to get it to go back to having the pigment and all the little reflective flakes uniformly distributed in the paint. Don't be tempted to add water to it. If you can, just mix it up a little bit, roll your brush in it, get the paint loaded up on the brush. Don't overdo it, and then we should be ready to go. So now we're just going to remind you that with our light source being over the top shoulder, the brightest spot in this is going to be here on this top of his head. So I'm going to put a dot of this dragon gold on there to remind myself that's the lightest spot on the mini. That's where I'm trying to create the highlight. Okay? All the other brush strokes I do are going to aim towards that. Now, these metal paints are very sticky. Just a little light, a gentle, light pressure brush stroke is going to put quite a bit of paint down. So you don't want a huge amount of paint on your brush. And you want to do light brush strokes, and you want them pointed to go in the direction of towards your light source. So that's why all my brush strokes are going upwards. I do not want to completely cover over the previous layer of paint. I want to partially cover the previous layer. So some of that matte red paint that I put on at the start, the mixture of red and green, should still be visible in the crevices after this coat of paint goes on. I'm not covering over everything. And as a result, this gold is going to look kind of patchy at this stage. And it's going to look really patchy until it dries. Okay, and then it's going to look worse. And that's okay, because we're going to be still putting a couple of more coats of gold paint over this. It doesn't have to be perfect in one pass. I'm going to focus on areas which are outwards convex, like this tongue. It has a raised area there, which is a round shape. So I'm focusing the paint towards the center of those round shapes. And part of that gross chalkiness this paint has right now comes from the fact it's been sitting in the wet palette, getting mixed with water. So it's not at its optimum condition. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't put metallics in their wet palette. They work with them on like in a well palette or on a dry palette. When I was learning to paint, I used to put them on a piece of tin foil instead of putting them on the palette. Now I'm just going to use a layering process and make them do what I want them to do anyway. Do that nose, outside of the nostril, or orb of that eye. Right, all these round shapes that point towards our light source, we want to make sure that we've got them well highlighted. Arch of that brow, definitely. Arch of that one. These round shapes. There we go. A bit more of this down there. Now remember, we've got the new gold coming later, which is a much lighter gold color. So we don't have to make this create perfect highlights right now. We're going to make them even brighter later on. So focus on the main shapes for now. Start at the bottom of the shield again. Pull the paint upwards. Now you could dry brush this. And if you dry brush this, you would want to make sure there was practically no paint on the brush, and you have your brush strokes all start at the top and go downwards, right? So that you're only hitting the raised areas that point towards the light source. Some people like to do like a circular dry brush motion, and that works when you've got a really good texture, a nice high relief texture, which this face is not bad for that. But I think you would find that most of these creases would get filled in with paint, particularly on the top part of his face. He might lose a bit of his expression as a result. So that's why I prefer in this particular model manually brush all those highlights in. Starting to look pretty creepy. And across the top of the helmet there, what's this thing called? Shield. Not super fond of the way the paint's looking today. It's got kind of a nasty, pasty look to it. Oh well. We're gonna bash on anyway. I quite like this dragon gold color. It's really bright. It's got a nice consistency to it usually. Okay, so all the metallic bits now, we're gonna highlight this bit of scale mail. I'm just gonna little daubs of gold paint on the more raised areas. Not worried about trying to paint the whole thing uniformly. That's good enough for me. The one under his arm in there is quite in the shadow, so I don't really want to paint all of it this bright gold color. Just going to put like a little highlight of it on it in that kind of most visible spot right in there. Same thing on this round shape on his shoulder. Doesn't have to paint the whole thing, but we're going to do the top of it closest to the top of the shield. Same thing in here. Most forward bit of that. Same thing down in there. The upper part of that, we're going to just dab the gold on there. Try not to hit the cloth around it. The trim of that is going to be gold. So get a bit of gold on that. This is going to be silver in here, so I'm not worried about that part. And we want to get this little gem housing to be gold, but without getting the gold on the cloth. So I'm not worried about getting gold on the raised part, which is eventually going to be a gem. We'll paint that black again later before we paint it as a gemstone. Just focus on hitting trim areas, make sure they all get this color. But don't forget that that piece around his neck is a bit of cloth, so we're not going to paint that. But these blades on his shoulder pauldrons, these definitely get this gold color. Focusing mostly on the edges of them. Same with this one. And the one on that shoulder. Okay, so now the helmet. The light is that way. So we want the brightest part of this helmet to be around there. Not directly towards the light, just a little bit away from it. So I'm going to pull my brush strokes that way, and then reverse and go the other way. So the most paint gets deposited, oops, right around there. Yeah. If you're finding that the metallics are falling apart too much on your wet palette, nothing wrong with using a dry palette or something like that for the metallics. And the raised parts on these wings, anything which is like an outward rounded curve is getting hit with this. Go. Forgot about the shield in the middle there. Not going to do the whole shield and focus on the top left side of that round shape, because that's closest to the light source. It's going to have a brighter highlight on it. Okay, there we go. What's next? Trim on this mace. Same idea, just a bit at the front. Not going to paint this over the whole thing. And a dot on that round bit at the top. Turn around, same idea. Lights that way now, right? Lights coming from this direction. Just keep that in mind as we go. So like on this shape, the light's over his shoulder to the right. So we'll focus the brighter gold color towards that direction. Same thing on the helmet. Focus on that side of the helmet. It's really interesting to see how the metallic paints change their behavior. When I did this exact same paint scheme, well, pretty close to the same paint scheme a few days ago, the paint behaved quite differently. Today, it's being very gross and pasty. Same thing with these, as we did on the front with these bits under his arm, just a tiny bit of gold highlight. Not painting the whole thing gold, just enough to bring the shape out. Make it look shiny. Wow, this gold's looking gross. Right. Maybe some fixes needed later. Okay, so we'll let that dry. And I think now we need to do the base coat of the steel. So I'm going to grab some, what do we got on here? Honed steel, I think, is what I was planning to use. Doesn't really matter what silver you use. You want a darker steel metallic, darker silver metallic. And we'll do this fairly quickly before the paint has a chance to fall apart on the palette too much. All right, so this color is going to be on this shield bit. And we're going to do it on the head and the handle of this mace. Work our way all around the head of the mace. Just the head of the mace done. Now we do the handle. Try not to get the silver on his gloves. There we go. There's all our silver metallics done. Give them time to dry. And we're going to go back and work on our red now. All right, so we already did first layer of deep red. So I'm going to switch over to the blood red. Get some paint ready to go. Get my brush loaded up. Going to follow the same pattern as before. Going to start looking in the shadows and then work my way around the mini. So in the shadows on the shoulder, it's just really the bit right at the very top that's going to get some light on it. So I'm just going to focus on the most raised areas of the cloth. Not close to the shield, but closer to his body, where a bit of reflected light might hit. And illuminate those sleeves just a little bit on the tip of his thumb, those fingers holding the shield, and a little bit on that sleeve. That's enough. Doesn't need that much under there. It's not. I don't want to be that visible. And then I'm going to focus now on these pieces of raised cloth. And I want to make it look a bit shiny, so we're going to make the highlight kind of centered along the most raised part of the cloth. So for each of these highlights, I'm going to start up high, pull a bit of paint downwards, and I'm going to reverse direction and go sideways and bring, so basically create two overlapping drops of paint by coming from one side and then to the other on each of these highlights. And each of those lines of overlapping dots are going to line up kind of in a line in an arc down the cloth. Makes this a little bit of a map where the future highlights are going to be in that zone. This part of the skirt, same way as I did it before. A little bit on this part. Now this part, same idea, but instead of having the highlight strongest in the center, we're going to make this highlight quite strong, very close to that little shield. So I'm going to do a little bit of a red line running along the front. Then each of my highlights coming the other way, I'll pull them in to overlap with the one that I just did to create a stronger line of highlights. Quite close to the center of his body. And I'm doing it that way because the light is on that side. So these highlights are closer to the light. And because they're going to be lined up with each other, it's going to give the illusion that the cloth is a little bit shiny. There we go. I do the sleeve the same way. Want the highlight to be around there on the sleeve. That's what I'm aiming for. So I'll start at the top and pull down to that spot. Just focused on the raised areas. And then I'll reverse, start about 2/3 of the way down. Do my brush strokes pulling upwards on those raised areas to overlap with the ones that I just did, the highlights that I just did. Okay. The glove does not need to be super shiny, so I'm just going to dab the red onto the surfaces which are closest to the light source. Tips of the fingers, the knuckles. When I get around to this side, the light's not going to hit there directly. Just hit the knuckle parts of the fingers and the top of the glove. Then on this part of the cloak, light coming this way is going to catch the top of the shoulder. Same as I did on the front. But on this side, I'm only going to go about halfway down because the back is going to be overall darker than the front. But when we're done, go about halfway down. Then my brush strokes still go in the same direction towards the top. There we go. This zone in here, it's not going to get a lot of light, but it might get a little bit of a bounce light, so we're going to give it similar highlight to what we did in the front, just not quite as bright, not quite as big. But down at the bottom, the light coming past might catch a bit more of that, so we'll make that a little bit bigger. And where it flares out at the bottom here, might catch the back edge of that. With this, we had decided we were going to make it quite a bit brighter at the bottom, so same idea, start about 1/3 of the way up. My brush strokes pull towards the bottom so that most of the paint ends up deposited in that area which is flared out into the light. And the raised part up here, I'm going to start quite high up, go downwards, just onto that raised spot. And then go from the bottom upwards, overlapping the highlights to make them nice and bright. There we go. This area in here, right at the top of his shoulder, might catch a bit of direct light, not much. Hit a little bit up there, but really not much light at all. It's going to get in behind that shield, so just going to do a little bit of a highlight right at the top. This zone in here Could be a little bit brighter. But again, it's not going to get much light, so we're not going to make it very bright. This is probably as bright as we're going to go in this area. Then we get down to the bottom. Same with that little bit that flares out there. It's going to catch a bit of light. And as we get here, we're starting to get back out in front of the shield again. So that's going to get a stronger highlight. All the way around to our back to the front. There we go. There's our red highlight. Now we went pretty slowly around there, so that's dry enough that we could do the next highlight right away. And we will. So we're going to take a bit of that red out of the reservoir, move to the side. I'm going to get a dollop of the golden blonde and mix that in. It's going to make it look a bit pink. But there's a bit of a yellow component in that golden blonde as well, so it's not going to be too pink. You can do this with a very light flesh tone as well. There we go. And now this highlight color, I'm going to put it in all the same places I did the last layer, just smaller. And I'm going to avoid the shadow. So like under the shield here, really doesn't need any of this color. We're going to have that line of highlights going down the cloth. So I'm just going to put like a little dot where I want that line of highlights to be. So work my way down. All the way to the bottom. So now as I go along, I'm going to line up my highlights. Go from above, up from below, to line up on each of those dots. And overlap on each of those dots. Essentially, where I put those dots, I'm now going to have 3 layers of this highlight color very quickly. Build up. And that's going to really lighten that area, but also brighten them. Lots of bright red going in there. Okay. Same thing down here on this flared out bit. I'm going to put a line of that color. All these, same idea. More on the side facing the light, less on the side facing the shadow. Okay, this piece in here, there's an outward curve in there that some bounce light might get, so I'm going to put a little bit of a highlight on that. Not too much. This side of this round piece is definitely going to get a highlight from the light coming this way. So I'll put that in around there. Come from above, come up from below. Nice light colored highlight. And then the ones on this side, I want them to be quite close in to the body. So my line of highlights is going to be something like that. And again, by lining these up, that's how we get that illusion of a bit of shininess. And same idea, start from the outside and work in onto those dots that I made. And then come from the outside, inwards, lining the highlights up on top of those dots. And that's going to look pretty bright. Okay. Down here, don't need much. A little bit of a highlight in the flared out bit, kind of in the middle of it. The shoulder bit. Oh, I forgot to do the collar. We'll have to go back and do that. The shoulder bit, I want the line of highlights to be not right on the top, but just down from them. So kind of along there. It's the highlight position. So I'll start from above and pull down to that position, reverse it, and then go up from the bottom. Now last time I started down there, I don't want to be that far down, maybe half of that space. So in about there, and the brush strokes now go upwards to overlap with those highlights I made. Dots on the non-shiny leather to create the highlight facing the light source. tips of the fingers, tops of the knuckles. There we go. And now we're going to do the same sort of thing on the back. Top of the knuckles on the leather. Not all of them, just the two that are at the top. Top of the cuff. And then this section here is going to have a bit of a highlight. Nowhere near as bright as the front though. Just a short one. We did about that much last time, so we're going to start much higher. This highlight's not even going to be a centimeter long. Same idea, we want them to overlap in that high area up there. Now these highlights along the back are almost light enough already, but I'm just going to put a little touch of this color in a line down the middle of it. Give it that tiny bit of a hint of shininess. And a little bit more at the bottom where it flares out. Okay, now we're on to this zone. Same idea as last time. We started about there with the highlights last time. I'm going to start quite a bit further down. We started there. I'm going to start down here. I'm not going to completely cover over the previous one. I'm not going to completely cover the previous highlight. That's what I mean. That zone down there is barely going to get hit. Just a little touch out towards the end. Up there, we set that highlight that we did earlier. We're going to re-emphasize that right at the top. Much smaller highlight. Pull downwards. Turn it around. Go the other way. And that part of the sleeve in there, same idea, small highlight, just right at the top of the shoulder on the raised areas of cloth. Not much needed in there at all. This section down here, that's really the darkest zone behind the shield. So I'm just going to do a little bit right at the bottom where there might be a bit more of that reflected light. Okay, not too worried about that down there. And there's that layer of highlight done. Now, I said forgot the collar. So I'm going to go back to the blood red. They seem to have they've decided to start sanding next door. Just a bit annoying. Okay, the collar. So I want to be careful not to get this all over the gold. Focus just on the raised areas of the collar. Go. Same thing on the back. Bearing in mind my light source is on that side, so I want that side to be a little bit brighter. The right side of his body always a bit brighter than the left. Yeah, the more I look at that dragon gold, the more I'm not liking it. I have to think of a way to correct that as I go. There we go. Nice bright highlight on there. And now we go back to the mix that we were using a minute ago. This partial mix of red and golden blonde. That's going to go on that collar as well. And then quite close to the light direction. But where it's so close to the top of the figure, the highlight can be quite a bit bigger. There we go. Same thing on the back, but focused much closer in to the light source because of the light direction. Good enough. All right. Next step, get more golden blonde, make another mix, which is more golden blonde still. Your ratio is probably 2/3 golden blonde, 1/3 blood red now. And we are going to do the same highlights again, smaller, focusing mostly on the ones on the front. So this zone up in the shoulder, we didn't do very much in there. Just a touch where it might catch a bit of light. And remember, we had that line of dots going down here. We're going to do the same thing again. Line them up along the curve. Okay. And then come from above. And then from below to line up the highlights on top of each other. So we end up with 3 layers of this next color on top of each other, focused in the center. There's a bit of cloth which is a bit recessed in there. That needs a little bit of this too at the top. Don't have to worry about doing it too much, but it needs a little bit. And this outermost layer gets quite a large highlight. Down here on this flared out bit needs a bit of a highlight too. Same thing on all these other ones along here as well. There we go. Get a little bit of this on these raised bits of cloth in here, because they're going to catch quite a bit of the bounce light. Same thing on that one. Nice strong highlight in here, close to the top. There we go. And on the other side, we get our line of highlights down the length of the body, like that. Much closer in, into there. And we do the same thing again. Double up those, triple up those highlights in the center of those dots. Again on this part of the sleeve. Come on, people. This bit of the collar. Lovely. A little bit on the back. We'll do the collar first. Just a touch in there. Along this area, same idea, just a touch. More at the bottom, more up there. All right, so the next thing we're going to do we do another highlight in the same spot with just straight golden blonde. Same idea, much smaller than the last ones. So the lighter and smaller we can make these, the shinier the cloth is going to look when we're done. There we go. And the question we ask ourselves is that light enough? I'm going to say no. And I'm going to do one highlight of that bright white color right in the middle of each of those. Make it really sparkle. Get a good point on my brush. And I'm going to focus on the ones closer to the top. So that collar, one of those dots. And I'm going to work my way along these ones, focusing on the ones that are closer to the top. Again, lining those dots up is part of what's going to make it look shiny. Across there. Tight white dots. We're not going to do this on the leather. We don't want the leather to look shiny. And then across the back, a light coming this way. A bit of bling on there. Not going to do those ones. Not going to do the... well, yeah, these ones we'll get. And maybe just a touch out at the end of those. There we go. Work our way around. There. Okay, super bright. Now, some of the blending on that's going to look pretty rough, but the highlights are in the right place. We can smooth that out, and to do that, we're going to do a glaze, a blending glaze. We're not going to do that just yet. We're going to give that a few minutes to dry. And while that's drying, we're going to go back to working on the gold. So now our gold here, as I was saying before, it's looking pretty crusty. And we got our new gold in the palette. So I'm just going to kind of take a look at this new gold now, and you can see how gross that has gotten, right? It's just turned into a bunch of chunks from the paint settling out, the water getting into it. So I'm going to give myself some nice, fresh, new gold paint to work with. And here we go. So As I said before, the highest, brightest spot is going to be there. Nice round dot of this bright gold there. And then everywhere else, the highlights are going to be lighter, closer to there. So we look for these round shapes, like the eyebrow of this creepy looking dude. I'll put a highlight on that pointing towards the light source. Same thing on this eyelid, orb of the eye, raised part of the cheek. Those highlights pointed towards the light. The upper part of his lip. Some nice bright highlights on there. Look at it on this other side. So I would say, again, the tongue needs a bit more emphasis. The edge of this piece along his mouth. It's funny, I think of this as being the miniature's face, right? The actual helmet and that part of the mini seems kind of irrelevant when you get a shield with a crazy expression like that on it. There we go. Super creepy and bright. All right, so we need to do a bit of a highlight on that triangle down in there, just a bit closer to the top where the light's going to be reflecting off of things around it. And then we've got these shoulder pads. The shoulder needs a bit of light. And on the wings, surrounded, center of the rounded shapes, going to give them a bit more of a highlight. So when I say rounded shape, I mean like this wing, right? It curves outwards, so the outward edge of the curve gets more of the gold. Same thing out on this one, gets more of a highlight on the outward edge of the curve. is. It's pretty gross, actually. So a little plate on his chest. We're going to do a dot of that brighter gold facing closer towards the light source up there. So I think what we're going to do, I'm planning to do a red glaze over all the cloth. And we're going to do that. But I think we will do a red wash over all the metallics as well. To try to deal with some of that weird effect from the metallics. So, red glaze. We're going to use the, let's use the brighter red. We're going to use the light blood red here for this glaze this time. Last time we used that one, the blood red. We're going to use, or the deep red. We're going to use the blood red this time. So I get a dollop of my red off to the side. I'm going to start adding water into it. My water ratio, there's not really a formula for it, but maybe 3 or 4 times as much water as paint. I want it to be really thin. And what I'm going to do is add a thin layer of this over the areas that I want to bring the red saturation back, which is really in the areas surrounding these highlights. So to test out my glaze, I use my thumbnail. There's bits of black and mark on there. I'm going to put my glaze across that to see how dark it is. That's probably a bit too dark still. Add a little tiny bit of water to it. Thin it a bit more. Get the excess off my brush. Try that again. Yeah, there we go. That's more like what I'm looking for. And you can see how wherever I lift my brush, it leaves a red dot. So as I move the glaze across the miniature, I want these red dots to end up on top of the areas which are already painted that color, which is kind of halfway between the dark zones and those white dots. So right in around there, this miniature is already painted this color. So as I do the glaze, I'm going to basically go across the surface and leave these red dots on top of the area already that red color, and then come from the bottom and do the same thing. And that'll leave a layer of red connecting this red to the darker areas and a layer of red connecting it to the lighter areas, and that'll smooth out the blend. I'll do that on this sleeve first. That's the easiest place to see it. So I'm going to start all the way up here and I go right across all of that down to around there. I'm going to pull this right across and down. And that's going to dull down those white highlights I made earlier. And then start down here and pull my way upwards. And end up in that same zone where I've already painted this color. And that's going to take down the brightness of those highlights, but it's also going to increase the brightness, the saturation of the red. Do that on his collar. Same idea. Right past. Same thing along all of these. I'm going to start at the bottom and go upwards, right past the highlights, and then just adjust the position of that red dot where I lift my brush off. So because the paint is so transparent, because it's so thin, those very light highlights that we made are going to show right through this layer. But it's going to have the effect of smoothing out the blending in all the red. Okay. Now why do we do it so thin? Well, it's so that you can control the final result. If you do it too thick the first time and you basically paint over all of your highlights with a paint that's too dark, it's hard to fix. So we do it with a thin layer. And if it doesn't have enough of effect, it doesn't dull down those highlights enough, doesn't increase the red saturation enough, we can do the highlight, this glaze again. And the second white might be enough, maybe it's not. Maybe you do a third glaze or a fourth glaze until it's just right. So using the very thin glazes gives you control of the final result. That is the core idea. I'm going to do it on the back as well. I didn't do this on the gloves. I'm not so concerned about the gloves because I want them to look like a bit rough leather. Go right past. And there's my little daubs of paint. And then I go from the bottom and pull upwards and leave those daubs of paint right across there. Right where I want them to be. The collar as well. Do that on here. And now if you get a flood, which would be where that paint fills in the bottom of a fold where you don't necessarily want it, like right in there. Get a second brush, which is damp. You put the tip of it in that crevice, and the damp brush will lift the paint back out onto the brush. And that's how you clean up your flood. I'll do another flood here in a second so you can see exactly how that works. These ones will start down low and move upwards. Oh, I said I was going to do another flood. I'll do another flood right in there. There's a flood. There we go. There's our flood. There's our damp brush. And then I just lift that back out again. Clean that up. If you wait too long, you'll get a coffee stain. But if you do it quickly, you just lift it right back out and good to go. And there, without thinking about it, I just start going and adjusting some of the other ones. All right, nothing to it. Do that one up on the shoulder as well. Nice bright red. Nice strong highlights. Nice shiny looking cloth. Okay. And now we're going to do a glaze over that gold. I'm going to use a darker red for this one. So I'm going to make a glaze out of the deep red. Same idea, add quite a bit of water to it. Now the only thing I don't like about this one is that this deep red does tend to leave a bit of a coffee stain mark, so you have to be a little bit more careful. But that's going to help with that that weird look from the dragon gold separating out on the palette. So I'm going to put that glaze over the scale mail, get a feel for it first. There we go, that's what I want. It really brings the red back in there. Do that over all these side gold pieces. There we go. Now, for the armor on the side of his body is a little bit more of a challenge. Do that glaze across there and then probably lift out the flood with another rush. Yeah, that's what we'll do right in there. Worked pretty good. Do from the top down and do the same thing. That worked reasonably well. Didn't need to do that there. Across there. That one got a bit of a flood. There we go. Do the one under the arm. Ooh, lovely big flood there. Go. And the one under his armpit on that side is more difficult. There we go. Do these side ones, and it's almost certainly going to get a flood on it. You know what? Not too bad. I can live with that. There we go. Do these armor plates up on his shoulder. The face of this is going to be a little bit more difficult. Do that last. This piece of the shield in here we can do. And we're going to get a bit of a flood inside the disc. Fix that later. And what are we on to next? Back of these shoulder pads. Get rid of the floods. Bat wings, same idea. Across, push it down. Yeah, there we go. On the back of that helmet. Okay. And now the difficult part is going to be this face. So I'm going to start at the top and just go all the way down. And then clean up the floods afterwards. I guess the way to go. I'm starting the top and going towards the bottom because the bottom already has quite a bit of this red showing, where we put that layer on of red mixed with green. So the coffee staining effect shouldn't be quite as bad that way. Got a nice coffee lane stain line right there because I was too slow. All right. There we go. Need to give that a bit of a minute to dry. we'll do some more gold paint over top of that. In the meantime, though, we're going to do a wash of black over the steel bits. I'm just going to use the dark green for that. Same idea, thin it down quite a bit. Put that right over top. That'll dull down the steel. Of course, I drift right off camera. There we go. And I'm going to do a bit of this on the steel plate on his chest as well. Okay. And I think we'll just do a bit of straight green liner on that gem shape. Nice and dark. Okay. Starting to look reasonably good now. Much happier with the look of that now that I tidied up that gold. And let's get a slightly smaller brush. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to get myself some fresh dragon gold. I really do like this color. Just it doesn't survive very long on the palette. Nice fresh daub of it. And we're going to reapply this dragon gold on our highlights on the gold surfaces. Didn't wait a particularly long time. Some of it might still be a little wet. No, I think we're all right. I'm just going to focus where I want the brightest bits of gold to be. There we go. That's more like it. Same thing on all these little shapes here. The highlights pointing towards a light source as usual. All right, our chest piece here, we want the gold highlight to be the upper left-hand side of it, facing towards light source. Same thing with these pieces on the shoulder. Yeah, much happier with that. Spike on the shoulder. Now, since all these other areas are already fully painted with the red, you do want to be quite careful not to mess them up again. Putting a blob of gold in the middle of them if we can. that shoulder. Okay. The helmet wings. Now we can fling those all back up again. Outside of all the round shapes, edges of all these little lines, get a little highlight of that gold. And we're going to be back again in a second with more new gold. New gold. There we go. Now we're looking at this creepy shield again. So, same as before, aiming for a highlight on the top. All right. So let's start on this tongue. All these shapes on the cheeks, we're gonna work our way around those. It's hard to get a good angle on this. I have it on camera. Go. Looking for all those round shapes that face towards the light, giving them a highlight on the bit of arc that points upwards. Okay, there we go. Looking pretty shiny now. And I'm going to give myself a little dab of new gold here in a second. In the meantime, I'm going to go back to my really crappy silver paint. And put a highlight on the length of those, of the handle. A bit of a highlight on each of these little shapes on this crazy mace. Okay, and I need a little bit on this shield, so right at the top of the shield. There we go. And I need a little bit of a lighter silver, so let's grab, that'll work. Okay, it doesn't matter what paints you use, just key thing to notice is that this silver is lighter than the one we've been using. Go back again. Now, you can look at the side of that. I don't want the highlight directly towards the light, but just a bit down the round shape from there. Sideways along like that. Shape of the object defines the shape of the highlight, right? So it's a cylinder, it's a long, straight highlight. Each of these shapes on the mace is kind of like a flat surface. So I'll just give them a highlight along the blade and on the edges of each of those shapes, each of those rivets. There, good enough. I'm going to do the same color on that chest piece. There we go, that's what I wanted. Super bling. Okay, and the last bit to add on there is going to be some more new gold. So some fresh new gold on the palette. Give it a good shake up. No, I keep saying new gold, but it's actually a color. Color is new gold. Not just new paint, it's the name of the paint. Nice and fresh. And we're just going to focus this on where we want the gold to be the blingiest. So on those parallel shapes like that, parallel to the highlight I made on the handle. A little bit on some of these scales, not too much. The edge of that shape down by the gem. On the upper surface, we'll get a little bit of a highlight. Upper surface, upper left-hand corner of that new shape, of that round shape. Give it a bit of an edge highlight on those shapes on the lower bit. That it can really stand out as shiny. That helmet's going to get one a similar position to this. It's basically a cylinder. I'll give it that highlight along there and an edge highlight on this Y-shaped visor. Up on the top of the ball. Edge of these plates. Edge of that spike. Mess there. Okay, bring those up. On the helmet, top of that same shape on the wing. Edge of all those little shapes. Put on the helmet. Edge of those shapes there. Bit on that weird gold thing on his back. Each of the rivets. And then we're back onto the creepy face again. So we're going to start on the tongue. Just hit the outsides of all those round shapes with the color again. Bring back those highlights. So like the eyes, top of the cheek. Side of the nostril, bridge of the nose, edge of the lip. And of course, right up here on the crown. Nice bright looking highlight up there. Okay, pretty happy with that now. And do one dot on each of those rivets on the shield, and we'll call it done. Feeling pretty happy with that. Okay, so a couple of last things. One is dark lining. Some of these shapes are not super well defined, so what I would normally do is take my black paint, put a bit of flow improver in it, so I can make long, thin, straight lines. And then just go back, and some of these shapes, like this little shield here, trace around the outside edge of it. The green line. Green because remember, we're using green as our black on this particular figure. Make a mistake, just rub it off. And that super dark shadow line helps make things stand out a bit. If our contrast is maybe not as big, not as dark as we would like it to be. Okay, so that made the gold disc stand out a bit better. That's the general idea. And last thing I said I would do is a gem. So we need a very light green. Let's use moth green. And we're going to mix moth green with let's mix it with the yellow. It's going to give us a very, very light green color. I'm going to paint that on the gem first. Here's our gem right here. Our light source is that way. So I'm going to paint this over most of the gem. making sure I leave a black boundary all the way around this little gem shape. Now the assumption we're making is that the light goes through the gem. So some light's going to go through and some light is going to be reflected. The light that's going to be reflected is basically going to kind of go from the light direction, hit the gem, and come out to the eye of the person looking at it. So it's not right on the top, it's a little bit down from the top where the light's going to hit and the angle is going to send it out towards us. The rest of the light is going to go through and be diffused and come out the other side. So that means the top of the gem is dark, the bottom of the gem is light, but there's going to be a very bright reflection dot on the top of the gem as well. And here we go. So this color is a combination of a little bit of green liner and the moth green. And I'm going to leave that arc at the bottom unpainted. And I'm just going to hit the top of the gem with this. My brush strokes are going to go upwards so that I make the top of the gem darker. Okay. A little bit of the light still showing around the bottom. Give that a second to dry. Add a little bit more moth green to the mix. Not moth green, green liner to the mix, darken it right up. And we'll do another layer of green on the top of the gem, pointing towards our light source. Again, not completely covering the gem, leaving the bottom of it a little bit of a lighter color. Then, if we're not happy with that, we can always go and adjust it. Go back and get a bit of our lime, or what is this, moth green. A little bit of moth green around the bottom again. Okay, pointing away from our light source. And then we can go one layer darker. We grab our green liner, put a green dot on top of that. Okay. And then the final touch is going to be putting a white reflection dot on the very top of that. Just going to wait a second for that. Give that a bit of a chance to dry. While I'm waiting for that, I'm going to do a little bit of a dabbed leather handle on this stick. Just put some dots of lighter color on it. Make it clear it's a different sort of surface than the other ones. Good enough. Now put a white dab right on top of that gemstone. I try to make this perfectly round because the gem surface is round. And in this case, the shape of the highlight matches the shape of the object. I'm just going to put a dab pointing in the general direction of my light source. There we go. And there's our super happy little reflective gem. And there's our Athak, the evil warrior, in red and gold. All right. And that is enough for today. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions about it, you're more than welcome to get in touch with us through the Discord and join us for one of the other paint-alongs. They're going to be most Sundays coming up, and we'd love to have you join us. And there was the demo model from last time. All right. All right. Thanks again. I'll see ya.